Welcome to today's webinar, presentation, discussion. This is a regular feature of the online study program of the Overseas Ministries Study Center at Princeton Theological Seminary. These online webinars and seminars and Meet the Author events include mini lectures, presentations, and in-depth discussions on critical topics in the fields of mission studies, world Christianity, and intercultural theology. I'm Tom Hastings, Executive Director of OMSC at PTS and editor of the International Bulletin of Mission Research. Firstly, we want to extend a warm welcome to all of our participants. And today we will be learning about Chinese Christian posters from 1927 to 1951. We're thrilled and honored that today's presentation and discussion will be facilitated by Dr. Daryl Ireland. Daryl is the Associate Director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission and Research Assistant Professor of Mission at Boston University School of Theology. He is an ordained minister in the Church of the Nazarene and has served in various appointments in Asia, Europe, and the United States. His research interests congregate around Christianity in East Asia, particularly revitalization movements in China and Southeast Asia. And he is the author of the recently published John Song, Modern Chinese Christianity and the Making of a New Man, Baylor University Press, Studies in World Christianity. Today, this is how we will proceed. After an initial PowerPoint presentation, we will take a break, and then there will be a second PowerPoint presentation. And following the second presentation, we will invite all of the participants to join the conversation. While Daryl is speaking and doing the presentation, please jot down some questions you might have, and you can either hold those and raise your hand later, or you can add them to the chat function on the Zoom button at the bottom of the page. And again, please be sure to remain on mute when you are not speaking. So for the first part of the presentation, Daryl will be touching on political theology. And the second part of the presentation, he will be touching on popular theology. So without further ado, I want to warmly welcome Professor Daryl Ireland. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me get this started. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for taking time and actually spending more time on your computer. I know that for many of you, that's become so much of your life. So this is a generous act of hospitality, and I appreciate it. But I'd also especially like to thank Tom for putting this event together, and for Kevin Volrath for being the technical wizard that makes a virtual event like this possible. I'm really looking forward to this time together because Chinese Christian posters are an uncharted area in the study of China and Chinese Christianity. Until 4 years ago, they had basically been forgotten. But over the last 4 years, the Center for Global Christianity and Mission at Boston University has canvassed libraries and archives around the world to recover Chinese Christian posters and make them publicly available on the internet. And we now have over 700 different posters compiled at ccposters.com. And I'm going to post that link for you in the chat, if I can do this right. There you go. So that you're welcome to go and explore as you would like. The task of gathering posters is now coming to an end. We've been working on this for 4 years. So it's time to begin deciphering what they mean. And today I'm going to offer 2 initial suggestions. First, I'm going to make a presentation about how these posters can be viewed as expressions of what I'm going to call Chinese political theology. And then we'll take a break, and then I'll show why I think these posters have something to say about Chinese popular theology. And at the end, as Tom Hastings had suggested, we'll have a time to talk together, because I hope that by catching a glimpse of these extraordinary posters, you'll begin to see what new windows they might open up on our understanding of China and Chinese Christianity. For now, though, let's focus on the posters that you see before you and how they competed with China's political parties, these propaganda posters, how they competed for the hearts of the masses of the Chinese people. And to get our imaginations engaged, let's just take a minute and look at the 2 posters before you. And let me ask, what similarities do you see? If you're going to speak, go ahead and remember to take your mute button off for a second. But what similarities do you see between these two posters?
I see masses of people following from below.
Mm-hmm. Great.
People worship.
Yeah.
The extended hand of Jesus and the extended hand of Chairman Mao.
Yeah. Right.
They're easy to read characters.
Yeah. Right. Very clear and bold, easy to read. Yeah. It also strikes me if look at what's in everyone's hand. What do you see?
Flags.
Flags, right? And what about what's in their other hand if they're not holding flags?
Bibles.
Bibles in one. Bibles in one, and what's in the other one, Tom?
The red book.
Yeah, the little red book of Mao there. So, I mean, clearly these are not identical posters, but I think there's a lot of similarities between the two. And I find it quite striking when you realize that the Christian poster was printed in 1927, and this communist poster was printed roughly around 1967, 40 years later. And yet it's only the one from the communist era that we remember. And yet it seems to have been adapting and adopting what Christians had been doing 40 years prior. And that's what I want us to sort of think about today, how Christians were in the mix of the political battles that were going on in China in the first half of the 20th century. But before we get to that, let's just get a little setting in mind. Today, it's of course common to hear people talk about the rise of China and its current ascendancy in the global economy and world affairs. And of course, that's true. China is a global heavyweight today. But the language of the rise of China makes it sound like it's something new, as if only now China has become a player on the world stage. And of course, that's completely false. Up until about 200 years ago, China was the world superpower. Its empire was enormous and prosperous. It so dominated East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia that for 2,000 years, the smaller kingdoms came to pay tribute yearly to the emperors of China. China was called Zhongguo, or the Middle Kingdom, because everything else revolved around it. But then in the 19th century, China experienced a shocking reversal. It suffered a series of defeats. It lost the Opium Wars to Britain. It was forced to concede part of its territory to imperial powers. Its economy was ravaged by European drug dealers. And because it lost a series of wars, China had to bear the humiliating costs of paying all the winners for their expenses of fighting their wars with China. And so in 1911, under sort of these combined external pressures and internal decay, the Chinese empire finally collapsed. And the world's greatest superpower was reduced to chaos. In its sort of wake, regional warlords sprang up and competed for power. Various banks printed their own currencies, and foreign countries maneuvered to exploit the situation. It was in that setting that two political parties emerged: the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong. Both understood that something had to change or it would be too late to 救国, to save the nation. China would be carved up and completely disappear. Those two parties still exist today. The communists, of course, controlled mainland China. The nationalists, when they finally lost to the communists in 1949, withdrew to Taiwan. And you'll hear me talk about both parties today because while they were working to save the nation, their words, not mine, so were Christians. Nationalists, communists, and Christians all set out to reverse China's fortunes and restore the country to its rightful place as the world's largest superpower. But to do that, they would have to address a series of major political and social challenges. And we'll explore some of those today. But for now, I want you to know the main characters in the story: the nationalists, the communists, and the Christians. You're going to hear a lot about them today. So if you're ready, we're going to begin. Let me take a sip of water. The Chinese nationalists bulldozed their way to power in 1926, rumbling north to Beijing behind a phalanx of pamphleteers. In their effort to defeat regional warlords and recreate a central ruling power, the nationalists briefly teamed up with the communists, and together they blanketed China with propaganda about the glories of the new government and its ability to save the nation. In Hangzhou, central China, the religious tract society watched jealously as the two parties, quote, using our means and improving upon them, end quote, brought the revolution to pass. Propaganda, the general secretary of the tract society concluded, had established the new masters of the Middle Kingdom. The nationalists, with the help of the communists, had made language and imagery subservient to their purposes of winning the masses. Could not Christians also use such tactics to inaugurate the reign of God? The general secretary issued a challenge to his fellow believers, quote, do propaganda work for your Lord and Master. Between 1927 and 1949, Christians heeded his call. Millions of prints entered the Chinese market, copied onto the cheapest paper and put on walls with starch and brooms. These big, roughly about 4 feet by 3 foot across posters, these big, brightly colored posters briefly attracted attention before they melted in the rain or were covered by a more current notice. Yet these silent preachers persistently hung in tea rooms, on city walls and temple gates. They were sometimes unfurled for street evangelism. They became the most prominent Christian visual imagery in China, and they persistently portrayed a Christian vision of how to save the nation. Christian propaganda intentionally aimed to topple China's other rival ideological systems. Some images set out and to target China's religious systems. So posters were printed explicitly to replace ancestral tablets or posters of the kitchen god. Others were crafted as substitute blessings to hang on doorposts. And then some images were created that more directly challenged the political systems of the day, depicting Jesus, as you saw earlier, orchestrating China's real political revolution. It's his army of evangelists that roots out China's enemies of foreign invaders, greediness, and laziness. Christian prints depicted an alternative vision of China's salvation. The kingdoms of this world, whether nationalist or communist, would ultimately fade before the kingdom of Christ. It turned out, of course, that the Chinese Communist Party didn't fade so quickly. Despite prolonged battles with the nationalists, the Japanese, and to a lesser extent, the Christian community, communists secured power by the middle of the 20th century. And their propaganda posters have since captured scholarly attention. A steady stream of books, articles, and exhibits have kept communist posters before the public. And that's a vital service. But it's only the winner's tale. Before 1949, it was unclear where China was headed. Christian propaganda stood alongside communist and nationalist materials, challenging, co-opting, and subverting their messages. Christians had their own vision for how to build China into a modern nation. Scholars have long assumed that by 1920, after the anti-Christian movement, political radicalization, and the victory of the nationalists, Christians had largely given up their political efforts to save the nation. But now we know that's not true. The recent discovery of Chinese Christian posters proves that the Christian community did not withdraw from public activism into a private spirituality in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s. On the contrary, we see Christian propaganda dispatched to vie visibly and doggedly for the soul of China. Between 1927 and 1950, Christians were part of an aggressive war for the political imagination of the Chinese people. The National Christian Council of Churches was one of the first organizations to heed the religious tract society's call for Christians to create propaganda on behalf of the kingdom of heaven. Within a year, the NCC, which was a large and normally cumbersome organization, managed to produce a bold new type of Christian poster. In 1927, before the nationalist army had even completed its northern expedition to unify the country, the NCC was sending out its own radical imagery to the roughly 1/3 of all Protestants that fell under its umbrella. Arriving in bundles of 100 prints, these posters aimed to saturate society. They were not for use in Sunday schools or designed to decorate a sanctuary. What you're looking at right now was meant for the public. The bottom of the poster provided very clear instructions, quote, "Please hang in a public space." The NCC imagery looks similar to what others were hanging in China. The nationalist poster that you see here on the left does not show an army of book-toting warriors, but it does depict how the Revolutionary Army rooted out Hong Jiaolin, Deng Benyin, and Lin Hu. Such traitors, the poster tells us, would no longer be able to harm the country through their exploitive taxes or by encouraging corrosive vices such as gambling and smoking. The Nationalist Army had brought peace and protection for the people and their properties. And in a similar vein, the NCC poster with Jesus driving out China's enemies has Jesus driving out China's enemies. But in this case, he doesn't need to rely on a shovel because Christ has an army of modern Bible-toting evangelists. The poster announces at the top, "Preach Christ, reform China," and more detailed explanations are provided in 2 boxes. The first on the bottom right points viewers to the New Testament book of Ephesians, and it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places." Now, if that might smack of withdrawal from the hard-nosed, day-to-day political realities to concerns over more hidden or spiritual dimensions of reality, then the upper left-hand corner makes the point clear. In order to save the nation, quote, "All believers shall act on Christ's last commandment to save the world. Our mission is to defeat all darkness and to hasten the coming of a bright new China on earth as it is in heaven." Above Christ's hand and behind the wall is a flag that declares the situation. Viewers are seeing the new China. The opponents of the new kingdom, presumably those who had held sway over old China, are running for their lives. In their fragmented and mad dash for survival, these dark figures, which are portrayed using traditional Chinese art conventions for ghosts, these dark figures leave behind the flags that reveal their identities. Anyone who looks at this poster sees Christianity trampling such politically loaded terms as foreign aggression, superstition, and social class. And in this presentation, I'm going to pair these sets of terms together so that we can look at foreign aggression versus freedom, superstition versus truth, and social class versus equality. By doing so, I hope we can see that when Chinese Christians spoke of saving the nation, they were talking about more than every citizen believing in Jesus Christ. They were also making claims about how Christ and Christianity could deal with the practical, social, and political challenges that beset everyone in China. Like the nationalists and the communists, Christians promoted their own vision of a new China. So let's start with foreign aggression versus freedom. By 1927, China had lived with the humiliating results of the Opium Wars for 8 decades. The sovereignty of the country had been slowly chipped away as it was forced to give up what grew to be 92 of its ports to foreign powers. In those cities, foreign quarters were created as islands of imperial interests. The Chinese government had no jurisdiction there. Foreigners had their own laws and police forces. When they ventured outside their international havens, merchants and missionaries still preserved the right of extraterritoriality. That is, under no circumstances were they subject to Chinese law. And this allowed forest businesses to circumvent such things as transit taxes. It gave Japanese businessmen, for example, extraordinary advantages over their Chinese competition. lower interest rates, fiscal exemptions, and lower transport charges meant that the Japanese mills in China could produce cotton at half the price of their rival Chinese firms. Wow. Nationalists and communists could look at this and disagree about many things, but they were united on one: foreign aggression was destroying China. In 1925, students developed a cartoon to communicate the foreign threat to the masses. Drawing on Marxist-Leninist teachings, anti-Christian students visually conveyed a clear message. Westerners, and especially missionaries, could present themselves, as this poster says, as civilized men and women. But in reality, they were monsters. They were especially sinister, so the propaganda went, because their treachery was masked behind high-minded ideals. What appeared to be an offer of assistance to China through education, agricultural modernization, and medicine was in fact a ploy, nothing more than a cover or a mask for cultural imperialism and economic exploitation. National salvation, communists communicated through this image, began by recognizing the reality of foreign aggression hidden behind the mask and then expelling the evil force from the country. A decade later, the presentation of crass foreign interests disguised behind a mask of benevolence and generosity had become a well-established trope. The Japanese even used it when they invaded China in 1937. After the Japanese military subdued China's eastern seaboard and pressed on to their infamous rape of Nanjing in 1938, they hung up their own propaganda posters in China. Look, look, this poster commands, the cruel injustices of the communists. The Japanese are presented here as liberating China, not only from the violence of the Chinese military, but in the alarmist fashion of propaganda, Japan is actually saving China from demonic foreign influence. The Red Devil, whose bag of money is financing the Chinese military, is now exposed. Communist Russia is revealed to be China's true, if hidden, enemy. So the consistent symbolism of masked figures representing imperial aggression in China made the Religious Tract Society's poster, Sin, the Enemy of Man, particularly interesting. Like all good propaganda, the image is not difficult to decipher. Here is a man pinned down by all kinds of vices: opium, alcohol, that's what's coming out of what looks to be a teapot, jiaobei, sort of dice for divination under his chin, prostitution, and gambling. And in 1936, these were all rather stock images for sin for the theologically conservative organization, the Religious Tract Society. But what about the person in the back? What is a masked figure doing there? Viewers, I think, understood it well enough. He represents sinister foreign interests. Zhou Chen, the RTS artist who composed this picture, is using iconographic clues to help viewers realize that this poster is not simply about the moral shortcomings of an individual. Zhou has turned the poster into a parable of China's present condition. The entire nation is chained and ensnared by activities that many had assumed to be harmless leisure activities, various kinds of amusements. Yet in its Epicurean reverie, China has rendered itself incapable of resisting foreign powers that now hold a deadly spear to its neck. The poster warns with these words: the wages of sin is death. Christian propaganda sent a clear message to those who had eyes to see. National salvation did not lie in revolution, modernization, or military strength. Unless China could first escape its self-induced dissolution, duplicitous foreign powers would make sure that China would die. In contrast to foreign aggression, Chinese Christians, just like their nationalist and communist counterparts, yearned for freedom. Freedom was most often expressed as an escape or a release, but an escape or release from what or from whom? Well, sin, of course, but what kinds of sins? Morphine, gambling, and prostitution were commonly shown as slave masters. And you may think those are individual or private vices, but it is important to remember that Chinese reformers and revolutionaries saw them as much more than that. The nationalists unsuccessfully tried to stop gambling in 1928. And when the communists came to power in 1949, they moved swiftly to eliminate opium and halt prostitution. Chinese activists of all stripes understood that these behaviors were not just threats to individuals, they had social and economic implications that affected the entire nation. Gambling siphoned money out of the economy. How was China to compete with foreign companies if its surplus cash did not go into new investments or into new businesses, but got pulled into games of chance? Prostitution was a public health disaster. Venereal diseases created a sick workforce and jeopardized China's future by increasing its rates of infertility. And drugs created divided loyalties and physically weakened users. Good luck building a modern military force strong enough to drive out foreign invaders with a bunch of addicts, the posters would communicate. These sins, as the posters called them, imperiled the entire nation. China needed Jesus to deliver it from slavery to sin. And Jesus' rescue had global political implications. Look at this poster. The image is of an eagle being set free, and the text states, "We have escaped from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken and we have escaped." And then it gives the reference, Psalm 124, verse 7. And that's important because if someone looked it up, as posters regularly instructed people to do, a person would find these words. If the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us. Let me read that one more time. If the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive when their anger flared against us. The flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging waters would have swept us away. Praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken and we have escaped. Think about that. Situated in its biblical context, freedom means freedom from foreign attacks, freedom from having China swept away. So when this poster shows the eagle escaping the fowler's snare, it hints that China can be relieved of Japanese tanks and liberated from British gunboats. Freedom from sin through Jesus Christ translates into freedom from foreign oppression. Granted, a picture of a bird being set free is a weak recipe for nation building, but it was hardly less vacuous than communist or nationalist messages of the time. Few posters forwarded specific political policies. Instead, posters provided aspirational visions. They aimed to portray the way forward, the path to freedom from foreign aggression. And for Christians, freedom was not about unmasking foreign interests, but escaping sin and foreign domination through the help of Jesus Christ. And now let's talk about, that was freedom or foreign aggression versus freedom. Now I want to talk about superstition versus truth. In the late 19th century, China borrowed a new word that had been coined in Japan, 宗教, or religion. Religion was introduced to separate what was helpful in modernizing China from what was not. A socially engaged faith like Christianity was defined by the state as a religion because it provided such things that could help the state, like education, poverty relief, and medical care. So if other systems of belief were going to help create a new China, they needed to likewise become a religion. Otherwise, they were only impeding national progress by propagating mixin, or superstition. That set off a scramble in China to gain political legitimacy. Confucianism, for example, made a valiant attempt to become a religion. Some advocates went so far as to present their beliefs and practices as mirror images of Christianity. They too had a sacred text, they said. They could point to Confucius's Analects. And they proposed that an expert would read from it from now on every Sunday at a Confucian temple. And afterwards, plates would be passed so listeners could make donations to the temple and its good works. Now, that effort to become a religion failed because in the wake of the 1911 collapse of the Qing dynasty, no matter what kind of makeover Confucian received, it still conjured up images of the Qing past and that old China. So it failed to be designated a religion. Buddhism, however, managed to organize itself, and so did Islam. And eventually Taoism received government recognition as well. But nonetheless, thousands, and you need to understand this, thousands of independent temples, often dedicated to local heroes and ancestors, didn't get recognized as a religion. They had no place in the Republic. In fact, by 1927, they became enemies of the state and were either destroyed or turned into public schools. A strong nation, the political authorities argued, needed to be rid of superstition. Stop giving money away to idols, the government publicized in pictures like this. Instead, it encouraged people to give their money to build China into a strong nation. The state's move to suppress superstition was actually an echo of what Christians had already been saying for at least a century. Christian posters were already denouncing idol worship. Let's look at this poster. This Christian poster clearly attacks idolatry, warns of the fires of hell, but it also has at least two political dimensions that the government would have appreciated. First, this Christian poster depicts a shrine to Tu Gong, a generic name for gods that oversaw local plots of land. So this lady is at a local shrine. And the nationalist government saw city gods and local earth gods as particularly pernicious. And remember, this was an era when the state was trying to build one nation and a united citizenry. So localism was always perceived as dangerous. So Tu Gong and temples like these were the most targeted in the anti-superstition campaign. And Christian propaganda encouraged it. Second, the Christian poster also depicts an older woman with bound feet at the local shrine. She is portrayed as a relic of the past. Christian posters were like other political posters that presented superstition in a gendered way. Women were particularly dangerous retardants to New China. And you can see that here in both posters. The nationalist poster and the Christian both only show women. But the similarities between the Christian poster and the nationalist and even communist poster attacks on superstition is not to say that the three were identical. Far from it. Whereas government propaganda called on people to abandon their superstitions and put their trust and their money into the nation, Christian posters clearly declared that the antidote for superstition was the one and only God. Now, there was a second way Christians also battled superstition. And that front was not on idolatry, but on the front of traditional Chinese medical practices that Christians believed were retarding the nation's health. Christian posters, therefore, tried to counter popular medical beliefs and practices with an injection of Western biomedical truth. They were not the only ones convinced that this was necessary. Chen Duxiu, the co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party, insisted that traditional Chinese medicine, quote, confused the world and deluded the people. He believed it needed to be abolished. And the Nationalist Party actually tried to eliminate Chinese medicine, but eventually had to retreat when traditional doctors and pharmacists accused the government of selling out to foreign interests. True patriots, traditional doctors announced in the press, would rely on homegrown treatments and remedies and not send their money to foreign countries for foreign equipment or foreign pharmaceuticals. So the nationalists ended up sort of backing down in this attempt to suppress Chinese medicine, but Christians didn't. They presented Chinese medicine as superstitious and a clear cause of China's present weakness. Weak bodies meant a weak nation. China needed something different. Sometimes it was as simple as suggesting more Western style exercises, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner of this poster. More often, it meant convincing people it was imperative to use Western medicine, as it says on this poster. The poster explains that a sick person could seek Western medicine to fight tuberculosis. They must also, the poster explains, get fresh air, eat well, wash their hands, and don't share a bed with someone infected. Failure to follow the poster's instructions would lead to the graveyard at the bottom of the poster, which, it is important to observe, is laid out in traditional graveyard style. That is, according to the superstitious laws of geomancy. So pictorially then, I want you to see this. Good health, biomedical truth, and life are conceptually linked together, while illness, superstition, and death are depicted as an unholy trinity. Only Christianity and its biomedical truth had the means to save the nation. Well, let's look at social class versus equality. In 1926, the communists and the nationalists built a coalition to unite the country through the Northern Expedition. But by April 1927, that military campaign stalled. More money was needed if the army was going to complete its push all the way to Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek made deals with the businessmen of Shanghai. In exchange for their financial support, he would eliminate the communist elements within his movement. Thereafter, the nationalists maintained a close association with China's bourgeoisie and pursued a reformist path to modernization. The communists, meanwhile, were violently purged. Their message of revolution and a classless society were pushed to various remote Soviets, which acted as relatively small and independent states within the Republic of China. So with communist competition pushed to China's extreme margins in the 1930s and 40s, it really fell to Christians to challenge class disparities in nationalist China. On the one hand, that meant a regular assault on those amassing wealth. Every single time money appears in a Christian poster, it is depicted negatively. It sometimes attaches itself to people with chains. At other times, money is drawn as sort of a money bag, as a deadly weight that threatens to drown people. In this image, the RTS produced a poster of a man counting his piles of money, and he sits comfortably with a cigarette on his lips and inspects his glasses. Poignantly, the lenses are 2 coins. In other words, everywhere this man looks, he will only see money. His entire world and all the people around him have been commodified. The map behind him reminds the reader of Jesus' words, "What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul?" But in case that message is too subtle, the poster is lined with further admonitions, such as wealth is worthless in the day of wrath, and he that loves silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. The bourgeoisie, the only ones in China imagined to have this kind of fabulous wealth, have been put on notice. Wealth was problematic, but Christians also recognized the injustices of the market economy. It exploited workers. Christian posters appeared showing how labor was consuming most of a person's waking hours if you were part of the working class. They also advertised that working class pay was too low. workers had to spend a disproportionate amount of their income on food. 56% of their money had to go to food. And wage gaps were also unfair. Women and children, who are less likely to organize in unions or work gangs, became prized employees because they cost the bourgeoisie half of what men were paid. So not all was well in China's new economic order, and Christians took an active role in publicizing and decrying the class issues that were stratifying the country's cities. The Christian prescription for economic inequalities was to improve working conditions and help laborers gain more equitable pay. Ultimately, however, true equality was not economic, but a spiritual reality. God's judgment fell equally on everyone. Sin was no distinguisher of persons or class, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Christian propaganda regularly clustered various social groups together, showing them burdened with the identical weight of sin. Although these are roughly drawn, one can approximate in the foreground a farmer, a scholar, a woman, and a businessman. And they all have the exact same baggage of sin tied to their backs on their march to hell. Here, class makes no eternal difference. Neither wealth nor poverty can save a person. Jesus alone saves, and he welcomes all to life and happiness. The Christian vision of equality, therefore, was not the communist classless society. Rather, Christians sought to relativize class distinctions. Money and status had no ultimate significance. Christians argued everyone was equal before God, equally sinners and equally saved by grace. Spiritual equality did not mean money and social class could or should be ignored. The posters repeatedly depict the upper class as the spiritually most endangered people in China. However, while Christian propaganda called on them to renounce their disposition to greed and covetousness, it never asked them to physically give their money away, nor did the posters encourage others to forcibly take the bourgeoisie's wealth. Christians wanted to reform, not revolutionize China, and they portrayed virtue, not violence, as the power to solve class divisions. That virtue did not come through Confucian self-discipline, as the nationalists sometimes suggested in their propaganda. Virtue came through humbling yourself, embracing your equality with other sinners of all classes, and thereby passing into a new way of life where you could be on different terms with both God and the brothers and sisters who now surround you. So let me wrap this up. Chinese Christian propaganda posters participated in the political debates that divided China in the second quarter of the 20th century. It didn't matter where you were on the theological spectrum. The arch-conservative Religious Tract Society and the progressive YWCA both printed posters in enormous quantities. Seemingly all Christians felt they could participate in the countrywide debate over how to renew China. Through the dissemination of propaganda posters, Christians promoted their own vision of how to 救国, how to save the nation. The temptation is to look at these posters that I've shown you today and begin quickly trying to situate them as either closer to the nationalist or closer to communist ideology. And at some point, that may prove illuminating. However, to do so too quickly would be to miss the significance, I believe, of what we've seen. Christian propaganda posters were not tools for disseminating nationalist or communist ideas. Their messages were never an endorsement of one party over the other. Christians proffered a third and distinct pathway for China. Through their own images, Christians sought to convey how China could be free from foreign aggression, purged of superstition by truth, and how it could enjoy equality in spite of social differences. In the end, Christian propaganda may not have defeated communist propaganda and communist guns, but for a quarter of a century, Chinese Christians actively displayed an alternative way of saving China. And we should pay attention. Communist China has now suppressed civic alternatives, but these posters remind us that there is more than one way to imagine China being a strong and modern nation. So that's my first presentation, trying to give you just a taste of how these posters that we've collected can interact and speak with new power and voice when you see them in comparison to nationalist and communist messages of the time. I will turn it over to Dr. Hastings here in a moment, and we'll take a break. And then when we come back, we're going to completely switch gears and think about how these posters represent popular theology in China.